Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from the Rockefeller Foundation offices in New York City. Welcome to this episode of the RF Breakthrough Series. My name is Estelle Willey, and I'm the Director of Health Policy and Communications at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel discussion. To those of you tuning in from your home or office, welcome. We're glad you're here, and we encourage you to join the conversation online using the hashtag RFBreakthrough and engage with us as we take a deep dive in today's topic of the day, addressing climate inaction through communications. Collective action on climate has either been too slow, too short-sighted, or too ineffective to date. And the impact is being felt all around the world. Climate change is already worsening the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world, a number that we expect to skyrocket in the years ahead without drastic action. Thankfully, we have many solutions and more in the pipeline that can help us curtail dangerous greenhouse gas emissions that directly contribute to global warming. So what is stopping us from saving ourselves and our planet? The data shows not enough people at any level understand that their futures depend on the collective choices that we make today. Nearly 2 billion people worldwide have never heard of climate change, a proportion that rises to 66% in countries like Bangladesh and Egypt, which are particularly vulnerable to its effects. Of those 66%, many see a warming planet directly affecting their lives and livelihoods, but most lack an appreciation of what they can do about it, or understand the direct consequences of inaction. While people in wealthier countries are largely aware of climate change, they often misunderstand that it is human-caused, and they perceive the risks as distant in time and space. In short, we lack the political and public demand for climate action. Writer and climate activist Rebecca Slownick put it plainly by saying, the climate crisis is in part a storytelling crisis. We are hemmed in by stories that prevent us from seeing or believing in or acting on the possibility for change. In order to do what the climate crisis demands of us, we have to find stories of a livable future, stories of popular power, stories that tap into culture, that motivate people to do what it takes to make the world we need. Essentially, we need to reimagine how we communicate about climate change, So that's why I'm super excited about this panel. Joining me today are 3 experts who have worked tirelessly on reimagining the way we engage with communities around the world to really empower them to take action on defining issues of our time. They have vast experience combining data and facts with engaging content that really breaks through the noise of our polluted information environment so that people can get access to life-saving information to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their communities. And during COVID-19, they were part of a team that created a new model for communications called Verified that delivered accurate and life-saving information and changed media consumption practices that increase protective behaviors like masking, vaccination, and testing, and reduce the spread of disinformation online. All lessons that we can take in addressing climate change. So joining me live in the studio, we have Melissa Fleming, who serves as the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. In this role, Melissa has the crazy task, I must say, of leading all of the global communications programs within the UN around the world, including your digital media services, your outreach programs, and global campaigns like Verified. Next, we have George Mngwala, an Associate Campaign Director at Purpose, a social impact agency. He is based in Kenya. And George is an experienced campaigner and movement builder with over 13 years of global experience leading social justice campaigns ranging from climate justice, energy access, and social reproductive health, and of course, COVID-19. And last but certainly not least, please welcome Dr. Patricia Pino, Deputy Science Director at the Amazon Environmental Research Institute, an environmental anthropologist Patricia works with indigenous communities in Brazil to better understand their perception of climate change. She's also a lead author for the IPCC special report on the impacts of 1.5 degrees of global warming, focusing on the sections related to equity, poverty reduction, and sustainable development goals. Welcome to you all. And on behalf of the Rockefeller Foundation, I want to thank you for your commitment to making a positive impact on the world. And we are excited to learn from each of you. So in the spirit of collaboration, as we move through today's discussion, please ask follow-up questions. Let's have fun with this. And hopefully we can inspire new ways of thinking and sharing our successes to reflect on lessons learned. Okay, moving on. So enough about me. I'm going to stop talking very soon. But let's set the stage before we move into audience questions. So, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we really did see how disinformation influenced people's perception of what to do and how to understand their role within, addressing COVID-19. And it felt like as much of the problem was actually people not knowing how to act, when to act, and why to act. So Melissa, from your position at the UN, I want to just give the floor to you for a second and really talk to me about why verified? Why was it such a new way of thinking and doing? And how did it fill a gap?
Thanks, Estelle. And it's so great that we're talking about communications around these complex issues that people feel a lot of fear around, or just, are bewildered by how this affects them personally. And COVID-19 was absolutely one of them. I mean, this crazy virus that swept the world, and people were really either afraid or just felt that it wasn't relevant to them. What we saw instantly at the UN was that we weren't just facing a global world health emergency, but also a communications crisis as well, because people were going to be asked to do things that they probably didn't want to do. Mm-hmm. It was very clear from the beginning that they would have to take personal measures. And also it was clear, just, knowing and studying behavioral science, that it would take more than an institution, telling them from, at Geneva, WHO, or New York City, the UN, or the Institutes of Public Health from whatever capital, that what was really needed was going to be trusted messengers and a new type of communications that we didn't have. We could send out the press releases, we could develop, centrally focused, centrally produced communications, but was it really going to reach people in this state? So we joined forces with purpose, and it's great to have George here because he was really instrumental in, because again, he was sitting in Kenya, and we had purpose colleagues and UN colleagues all over the world taking the content that was being produced en masse. We had like a content factory that was churning out bite-sized, and really kind of cool content that traveled really well in digital spaces, where we were seeing, as you mentioned, a lot of disinformation, a lot of confusion, and even information gaps where people were searching and finding nothing. So we were getting into that space, but we needed to do it. We needed to go local and hyper local. So just very briefly, what we took was the authority of the UN, the science-based content that WHO was delivering, and turning it into popular, popular, digestible, relatable. And I think relatable is a key word that we need to explore in depth as we go into climate as well. Content that was delivered not by us, but by people they trust. And that is key. And I think let's go into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And as we discuss this further.
That's great. Patricia, I wonder if you could give us more of like the data and research behind what Melissa was talking about. Why is it that relevant and trusted local messengers and messages, why does that break through the noise versus hearing from the WHO or the UN from their headquarters?
It's great. First, thank you for this opportunity to participate with Melissa in such a high level panel. I believe what I have witnessing, both as like someone that is, I'm from the science community, so I do communicate science outcomes, and I want to reach out outside our bubble, which is like talking among our peer. So both as a practitioner of like someone who is directing an institute that aims to do a change, as Melissa was saying, like I think at the core of this misinformation is the high level inequalities of who is like really feeling the impact, and whereas like some people like are just living by and then postpone that the impacts are distant, are not really related to their livelihoods. So as in COVID, so I work mostly with indigenous people and traditional population. So what are we envisioning as in COVID addressing these inequalities? So we produced like webinars and platforms where people can like advocate or and hear from the local experience. For instance, on the COVID, the indigenous people were like massively destroyed by a series of misinformation, as Melissa is describing. And unfortunately, we were even under a government that was completely denying science evidence. So we had like a double or triple times more work to do in terms of negating or overcoming the misleading messages coming from high-level government. So as you can imagine, so we produce like a series of facts and numbers that can people check the methodology. So to talk about that indigenous people are not only numbers, but lives that we're like losing because of irresponsibility, of denying the climate or denying the scientific evidence. On the climate change is the same thing. So the Amazon is listed as the first out of 5 main reasons to concern with climate change, according to the IPCC. Together with the article, because of giving the vulnerability of those unique ecosystem to collapse under increasing greenhouse emissions and temperature warming. Contrary to the article, the Amazon is part of the solution for our climate crisis. So although we do have the evidence, the scientific evidence to communicate this like eventually collapse or Amazonian tipping points, we still have like large forces, especially across multiple countries, as agro-commodities expansion, making invisible the impact of climate change and social vulnerability and economic impact. So we try to overcome this by evidencing like the solutions and talking about how much carbon emissions is stored in pristine forests that are protected by indigenous people, or also talking about multiple forms of injustice that overlap, like meaning that these people, the indigenous people and traditional population, are least responsible for the biodiversity loss and for the also forest degradation associated with climate change that's happening in the region. So that's the way, one of the approaches that we try to overcome like messages, and of course giving the voice to those people that usually are invisible in the discourse. And as Melissa brought up, this is like a mobilizing action of and communicating risks that kind of like link people together in a shared humanity, if you will. So understanding these multiple temporal and scales that are interlinked on the climate risks and how you communicating that.
George, when you were working on COVID-19 in Kenya, what Patricia was saying about people need to see themselves in the communications, right? So having indigenous people as the messenger was really powerful. Did you see the same thing in Kenya?
Thanks, Estelle. Definitely, it's not very different from what we experience in Kenya, and as well other geographies that we work in. But just to back a little, with experiences from COVID, there was definitely panic, there was fear, which we all know in moments of a crisis like this, when panic and fear takes over, also misinformation and disinformation takes charge. And communications then becomes very central. It becomes very central, not just in a mass way, right? It needs to be central, but also very people-centered. It needs to be targeted. And most of the times in a crisis like COVID, then the most vulnerable communities, the indigenous peoples that Patricia is talking about, are always left out, because a lot of the communications we had initially been seeing is abstract. It's general. It's meant to reach mass audiences. And then once it reaches the mass audiences, you leave quite a critical center, which is now, you say, the vulnerable communities and all the indigenous peoples, who most of the time, when information is too abstract, when it is too scientific, you get to lose them. And so good example would be with the work we did in Kenya with Verified, was the thinking around information is flowing. Verified is channeling, and Melissa used a very good term. We had this factory, an information factory. As we channel information out, it's reaching different communities and different masses of people. But we also went very targeted and thought, who are communities that would be left behind? A good example would be the displaced communities, the refugee communities in Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps. We got there, together with our partners, because you can't do this work, you can't get into communities without partners. You need to move in with trusted people, with people who understand the ecosystem and the area very well. They understand the communities. And we built a campaign that was targeted specifically for the displaced communities in Kakuma and in Dadaab, to help them understand what is it they can do within their means. Is it wearing a mask? Is it social distancing? And then moving, understanding the needs of the community, and ensuring that the communications and how the narratives you build are woven into the everyday fabric of the community, the understanding, the dynamics of the community. You come into an area like the refugee camps, there's a lot of challenges in there. So how do you communicate about a global crisis, about hand washing when access to water is a problem? How do you communicate about wearing a mask, right, when there is no money to buy the mask? How do you then translate that from wearing a mask, hand washing, into now there are vaccines, you need to get out and vaccinate? And the dynamics of it just depend a lot on who do you work with? How do you create these messages with the community so that it is best understood with the language they speak, with the kind of channels that they listen to? You can't get in and say you want to run content on social media. You have to get in and understand, do they use social media, or do they use community radio, or do they use other community interventions? Like in Kakuma and Dadaab, the community leaders are very critical. They become the trusted messenger. They become the channel of communicating to the population. There's a community radio station there. You use the community radio station. But most important is creating content and creating these narratives with the communities, because they best understand. They are the experts within the communities. So you help them translate science into very interesting ways of communicating, so they best understand, and doing it in a way that they relate to, with their own lived experiences, with their own understanding of how they do things. So very critical to bring them into play, but bring them in at the beginning of creating, co-create with them, meet them where they are, understand the channels they best use, and then work with the people that they already trust. Is it a faith leader? Is it their local administrator? Is it the head of the home, or the different communities around? And then information then flows very, very well and easily.
Right.
Thanks.
Melissa, I've been working in communications for a while, and so have you, all of us actually. And so many people that I work with who aren't like in this very specific space around communications and how we need to modernize. Many of them would love a New York Times front page article and would love a celebrity spokesperson. And they think, yep, we just need those two things and we're good to go. Talk to me about how you were able to change attitudes within the institution, because it really seemed like the biggest success and a key tenet of success for Verify was that hyper-local community engagement. And, it takes resources and time to really build the trust within those community messengers, to really build the capacity for them to feel comfortable talking about complex scientific information. And that requires buy-in from, leaders above and at the same level as you and even below. So wondering how you were able to do that.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thanks for mentioning that, because it does require a lot of internal work. And I think when we're talking about COVID, when we're talking or looking back at COVID and what was underinvested in, I think definitely a conclusion will be health communications, public health communications. I think the climate community is waking up to the fact that there needs to be much more investment also in communication. It doesn't come cheap, but you can, as you mentioned, you can communicate without reaching people and think that you've done your job, which is unfortunately what we see very often, because you get that front page of the New York Times article, or you get a celebrity to tweet something. That is not strategic communications. So when I came to the UN, I actually brought the principles of a communication strategy that I developed at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. And I've been to many of those camps that George refers to. And that it's a very simple, I mean, journalists have the 5 W's of journalism, who, what, where, when, and why. This is also important when you're putting together a press release, that you have all the facts and you've answered all those questions. But we're working for a cause. We're trying through our communications to persuade people to change for our common good. And so we have 3 W's, and our 3 W's are what is the facts, the science. That's what we're really good at. And that's what we have that we need to convey. And that's extremely important. But the next 2 W's are the challenge. Why care and what now? And the why care part requires you to think about your audience and who are you trying to reach? Who needs to have this information? And what is it that's going to get them to feel something, to feel that this is relevant, not just to someplace out there in the world, oh, that's too bad, but to me personally, to me, my family, my children, my community. And how do they receive their information? George mentioned this. Don't just assume that if you get something in the newspaper, that this person in your target audience is going to read that. You have to really think about how people who you want to reach receive their information, and you need to produce it and get it to them accordingly. And the what now part is really important. It was extremely important for COVID. It's very, very important for climate. People need to know that there is a solution. There's a solution that their policymakers, their governments could do if they acted. And there's this solution too that they can contribute to themselves as individuals, that there's agency. So Verified and all of our communications at the UN is attempting to do this. Of course, as you said, it does require enormous investment. The cheap part is to put out a press release from headquarters and then move on to the next. The part that needs investment is when you really try to focus on, and I think Patricia mentioned this too, the communities that are not typically reached by mainstream media, and how do we get to them, and then, and we'll come to that, I'm sure, how do we come to people when there's so much distorted and information out there that is leading them astray.
Yeah, so let's turn to Patricia. Talk to me about how you were able to reach these indigenous communities that you work with, and how are you able to build that trust in an environment where there was disinformation just coming from within, from outside, from literally everywhere, from government, from everywhere. How are you able to do that quickly? And really talk to me about, like, what does it take? What's that process look like for that really deep community listening and community engagement?
Oh, thanks for this. And it's, I think I will pick it up exactly what Melissa just mentioned of getting exactly where people feels it, either on their like health, on their livelihood security, or like place attachment, or when people feel that they really need to leave that place because they are like really being consecutively affected by some hazards, or so I'm talking about communities that has been impacted. So the level that you can connect is because they are feeling you are one of the voices that can like bring them some sort of support and help. So this is one aspect, but I also want to pick it up on the challenges that is working with different communities that we are also trying to engage, which are like, from instance, the agribusiness sector that is happening in Brazil, are a sector that are very powerful and concentrate money, influence, and power, and brings lots and lots of externalities. And it's a sector that we want to reach out, because they can make a huge difference if they change their practice, and as Melissa said, if they address the climate crisis and really committed to make that. But this is a sector that is really highly permeated with misinformation, or like scientific information that are maneuvered to deliver certain results that are not really like peer reviewed, so are like messages that are not like really articulated with the scientific community, but is validate among the sector, among the who is like supporting this type of audience. So the way we try to engage with this community that denies climate change, that denies their impact, or in still like establishing, you know, evidence that are like violating the, you know, land rights of indigenous people and so on and so forth, or increasing water stress and conflict. So this is a really like a challenge that we're trying to communicate in a speed ways. And again, it comes to like not talking about something external to their, that are distant to their lives, but also getting them this intangible aspect of climate change, or that are so complicated and interlinked. So we are like trying to communicate a message that are not like that can really try bringing like the invisible causes to like a more like immediate direct impact, and also addressing specific the lack of people feel that their attitudes, if they are doing something that mitigate the action of climate change, they're not going to be like gratificated for that, or they're in fact going to lose an economic opportunity. So how we link that to like more of ethical questions or moral questions that are like, I care about the environment not because of the indigenous people or the biodiversity per se, but because of my kids. It's a very selfish desire, motivation, but it's one that like mobilize people. They want to leave like something, a word that is, better than the others. So this is like some of the challenge that we are trying to address currently, because as we can imagine, like we highlight as like a scientific community the window of opportunity that we have to act as a global like a planet or shared humanity, that we really need to reduce emissions. We really need to commit to a different lifestyle. And then I think COVID show us that we had this opportunity of reducing greenhouse emissions. We are, able to mobilize. We are able to overcome these reading messages. But then like all the risks went away, and then we got the vaccination. And in terms of the climate change, people are like increasing the emissions right now because they want to pick it up the economic crisis as a global political economy that no country wants to be behind. So this type of challenges, I think, like are what we really have creatively needed to think outside the box and really communicating, doing our job of communicating with deniers, climate deniers, and conveying the message, and really like making a noise on sectors and governments and influencers that are really like, at least in a short time, receiving the most benefits of promoting a huge destabilizing crisis for the whole planet. So this is a little bit of how we are trying to do it, and also like showing that these multiple crises are interconnected. So the invisibility of indigenous people and their health issues with climate change, on fire incidents in the Amazon, is something that is coming out as an emergency. Do we really need to establish a loss and damage fund for the Amazon, protecting the indigenous people that in itself are protecting the legacy of our shared humanity for providing the global regulation service?
You talked briefly about something that I hope George can elaborate a little bit on from his perspective, about the power of partnerships. With the community engagement piece, it often feels like you do need to partner with organizations and also, platforms and whatnot to reach people where they are. George, can you talk a little bit about the strategies behind that?
Thanks. Patricia has, alluded to it already around how critical it is to get to audiences through partnership and building the right kind of partners. And so these partners are very critical, number one, to getting buy-in into communities, because you just can't get into a community without, being introduced and being welcome into a community. So establishing partners requires looking at number one, what is needed, who are the right kind of partners you need. And in times of crisis like we saw with COVID, we needed to reach mass number of people. Verified reached over 1 billion people, and it's because of the kind of right partners we built. Number one, thinking about the UN, the UN is credible, the UN is well trusted. It has the mass reach that is needed. And then beyond the UN, you look at who, has direct access to the communities. We find, is it, different trusted messengers within a community. For example, in South Africa with the verified work, we went into Kailitse in Cape Town, and our entry into Kailitse was with local partners, the South Africa Red Cross, UNICEF in South Africa, young artists in South Africa, graffiti artists, or a football coach, someone who is already well trusted, understands the ins and outs of a community. They easily would get you in with the right buy-in. They would help you deliver or help you create messages and narratives that relate to the community. And then you look at who would help once I've created these kind of local partners that are needed. How do we amplify the work that we're building with partners? Then, comes the organizations with credibility like the UN, or now media. If you think about companies like MultiChoice in South Africa, was also very critical to amplifying the kind of work we are doing. UNICEF in South Africa was very critical with amplifying, but we built, partners on ground who have the reach within the community. They have the trust and credibility. Then we're looking at who becomes the amplifier, who creates the legitimacy that is needed, and so I look at the partnership as also a critical aspect that we miss a lot when we develop strategic comms, and we need to be thinking about, who is it that meets people or reaches people where they are. Is it the local radio station? Is it the local faith organization? Is it the local NGO within an area or within a community? And then who helps amplify this work? Who exists within the space that would be an amplifier? And then is it the role that the UN would play to really amplify and elevate the different issue areas that we are seeing? And then also looking at partnership from, the people who not just help design the work, they don't just help amplify, but they also, are very knitted within the communities and help in spreading the right information. They help you understand, who do you speak to, Estelle, when you, come to a country like Kenya? Who do you speak to first? And who do you engage, who you get very close to co-create? Who does my grandmother trust? That's the person that you create the partnership with, to be able to create communications that are very targeted and build the right of partnership that you need to expand and grow the work across the different areas. But also, most important is, finding a way to keep communicating with the different partners you put together, keep sharing or even oversharing information with them, because then they get in and on it, and can also look at sustainability and scaling. When you have exited, when you created information, you empowered them, you trained them, who runs the work beyond. So the partnership also, the right kind of partners also help in building the work going forward, so that it's embedded and led with the communities, but also it is carried forward beyond an intervention. Like now, the learnings from COVID, from the work Verified has done, we're seeing it now, different partners we worked with starting to run the work across other issue areas, expanding it across other vaccination areas. Now we're thinking about how do we use the learnings with Verified, on climate? How do we create strategic comms to support climate action with communications? And it's because you build the right partners, you've really supported and empowered them for them to be able to carry the work, beyond yourself.
Fantastic. I did want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about, what are the learnings that we can take from COVID to climate, but, there are some differences. COVID being really time bound, climate change being a very long, slow burn, forgive my pun. But for all of you, I'm just going to open it up. First person to respond goes first. But what do you see as the unique challenges of climate change? And how can we address these moving forward for more effective communications?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that there are definitely differences, but I think one big similarity is polarization. And, we're seeing, and that is a huge challenge to communications, because it's not about facts. In many groups, like Patricia was speaking of deniers, some in the field call them the dismissives. They have the loudest voice, the biggest megaphones, and yet they only represent about 8% of people out there. And the vast majority of people, you mentioned some don't even know what climate change is, but they do actually. They just don't know the term.
Right.
So I think everybody is feeling a certain sense of, oh my God, something is looming, something bad is happening, and it is related to a climate change or warming climate. But yet in their kind of tribal communities, they're hearing voices that are saying, perhaps, well, this is natural. It's a cycle that we've, dealt with before, and giving them, false information about what needs to be done, and particularly to protect what they've always had. And many people feel very privileged in their ability to drive their car, take their plane, open their refrigerator, and they are worried about what the alternative would be. So I think what similar again to COVID is we have to think about where people are coming from here. And it's not a kind of one size fits all communications. I think we also need to feel to look at who we need to target to move the needle. I don't think it is worth trying to convince people who are already dismissive that climate change is real. They've seized this as their issue to rant about. So they're all the people in the middle. It's very similar to COVID. It's very similar to communicating about refugees. There are people who are starkly opposed. It's very politicized, but the persuadables, the middle, who needs to understand, actually, this is something that is relevant to me, and then to find what is it that could get them to understand, what is that kind of shared activity or value. Ask them, what do you like to do? Do you like to garden? Do you like to eat wonderful food? Do you like to go skiing? And then to talk to them there about how the changing environment is having a detrimental effect on the air they breathe and the food they eat and the sports they like to take part in. So yeah, maybe that's just to open it up to others, but I do think there are many similarities, and especially in how we communicate with people.
Great. George, Patricia, do you want to come in?
Thanks. I think for me, the biggest challenge I see is over the years, we've kept talking about climate from a very abstract way. We put everyone in a box and in the same box. Whereas climate needs to be about lived experiences. It needs to be about, cultural nuances. It needs to be about how do we translate the science that's there about climate to experiences across different communities. What someone is experiencing in Kenya is not what someone is experiencing in Turkey. It's totally different. And we can't keep communicating about climate from a very closed box. We need to be talking about climate in a very nuanced way, and centering people. I would say, centering people, centering the experiences, centering the dynamics they are in. Is it about water for them, or is it about food? Is it about concern about animals they have? Is it concern about education? It needs to be relatable. It needs to be lived experiences of people, and then just ensuring that we also are not creating fear. We're not creating doom, which we have also done, and then people tend to stay back and say, there's nothing I can do because the world is ending, rather than saying, each of us has a role to play, and really communicating and showing what role does each of us have to do with climate action. Is it about information I share? Is it about just the little things we do? And good case would be the environmental activist, well-known Wangari Maathai, has she alluded a lot to the hummingbird. It's the little actions you do. We need to keep encouraging communities about the little actions they do that then encourage our political leaders to take action. They build the political base, they build the political cover that our leaders need to take action because of the small things that they are doing that add up into larger. But also just being very clear with what action do we take. Because most of the time also, as I mentioned, it's very abstract, but also we don't show the call to action. We don't have clear call to action for the different communities, different audiences we speak to. And then lastly, I would think we also tend not to build trends. We don't look forward. We don't anticipate. When the IPCC report is released, how do we use that to build trends and support in translating the IPCC report into very, nuanced information, very relatable information, and saying, how do we build the trend? How do we look forward with it? And so we just have to move away from talking about climate as here is climate change, and then we lose everyone else, rather than how do we then relate to other entry points, other nexus. Now people are talking about climate and health, or climate and food security, climate and water security. Then it becomes home. It's part of something that everyone is concerned about. Communities want and feel there's something they can do. Political leaders know there's something they can do. Business leaders know there's something they can do, and we bring everyone together. But something I keep repeating as well is our communications has to always meet people where they are. How do they understand? How do they relate? Then how do we back it up and say, here is what science says, here is your lived experience. How does the two connect? And ensuring that we are communicating that and bringing everyone, welcoming everyone into the table.
I can just reinforce before going to Patricia, one point that George said, which I think is so important, and that is the fear communications. It works for some people, like it does, instilling fear by your alarm in the way you deliver your speech or you put out that tweet. For some people, it will cause them to say, oh my God, what can I do? I'm feeling. But for many, and we're seeing this a lot, and there's studies by the Reuters Institute, for instance, recently, that increasing numbers of people are turning away from the news. And the climate news is something that many news organizations are seeing, young people especially, because of the gloom and doom and because they feel that there is nothing they can do. So that element of inserting solutions into that, maybe creating worry is better than instilling fear, because if people are worried, they still feel like, oh, I'm going to search for something we can do. And finally, though, I really like what George said about those doing yourself, the individual, your little things, but also not forgetting that it's not all about individual action. The real problem is that fossil fuel companies are spewing CO2 into the atmosphere. So it is something bigger, and we need, though, that collective pressure, and that's what George said, for political action, because we're not going to see this happening on its own.
Great. Patricia, you are a lead author of that IPCC report. So I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about the differences between COVID and climate change, but I was wondering, we would love to hear your perspective as well.
Oh, thanks. So I think when we did this, when we were writing the report of the latest cycle of evaluation of the IPCC, we were in the middle of the pandemic. So we were also facing multiple challenges ourselves as authors, especially those situating the global south with like deniers at the high level government. So then we came really to dig in on the challenge of communicating our like dramatic findings. And I think in the context of climate change, as much as in the COVID, but then I pick it up some of the exceptions later. But so we try to address three major issues. First is the complexity and uncertainty issues. So climate change is very complex. It's like made most of the cases, the emissions have been occurring over a long period of time before you can actually feel the impact. So another aspect is that, for instance, drought, when communities are affected by drought, depending on the scale of their economic dimension or the socioeconomic dimension of the community, when it's a slow set event that one set event, when you get, it's almost too late to escape. So, and that's the trap we are in. So, and then we get the complexity aspect of also uncertainty is linked to the weather, is what we get. We don't control it, right? It's gonna rain and it's gonna rain, or it's really raining, although like we have like, you know, culturally some of communities praying for rain. In Brazil is full of examples of how, like, you know, spiritual leaders are like really using their praise for addressing challenges related to climate, because it's really what you get. So you feel a certain level of uncertainty. So the second aspect is the the completely inadequate signs indicating the need for change. So as Melissa is saying, like we have higher polluting sectors that still like portraying and patrocinating messages that are linked to my third point, is that the perpetual limits and self-interest. So we still having this big messages being spreaded, and that give like the youth a sense of despair. Okay, no matter what they do, like big messages, like people are not doing enough at the higher level, or are not like making a scenario where we can enabling actions across multiple levels. So that's where we are picking up really on the complexity and uncertainty. Yes, it is complex and it is uncertainty, but the certain level of impact is this dramatic. So let's act on this. Another like question is the inadequate science. So we don't have the enough from powerful sectors, from lead sectors that are really depleting the you know, or suppressing what we call planetary boundaries. We know who they are, and they are not doing enough, and then we are not getting the message of that like we can do this, and then empowering people, indicate the need for change. And then the other link to that is that we you know, spread this message of, although it's like 0.01% of the world population that are benefiting from this short-term economic growth, or of the highly depleting and climate damaging sectors, also show the self-interest across within countries and also across different countries. So I think like if we are able, and as like I can tell you from the scientific community, we are trying to address these three issues when we are communicating our science. And then I know it's like not enough, but it's one way that we can really attribute some immediate causes. And that's what is driving us to do actions, at least in South America, to mobilize in these huge sectors. And we need to do more and joining forces.
That's fantastic. So we have only 10 minutes left. So I did want to turn over to some questions from our audience. The first one's actually going to be a tough question, and I'm directing it to Melissa. But the question is, there is an elephant in the room, and it's social media companies and how they're incentivized to spread harmful falsehoods on platforms. So how do we better collaborate with social media platforms to improve the online information ecosystem? What a term, online information ecosystem. But I thought maybe you could respond to that.
Actually, I like that term. We use it a lot because we look at well, first of all, our entire information ecosystem is polluted. So I think it's very similar to the environment. If you have a polluted information ecosystem, you're not going to have healthy societies. You're not going to have societies that trust science, that trust facts, because they're being bombarded with very powerful other pieces of information coming at them from individuals, which makes it even more complex, because we were talking in this whole conversation about trusted messengers, and they very often see people they recognize delivering messages that are not are sometimes distorted, sometimes they're just blatantly false. Other times we see attacks on people like Patricia. It's rampant on social media, attacks on climate scientists, on climate activists, the same in COVID. Anyone who was speaking out for vaccines, including me, was getting attacks, even to the level of death threats. We do see that most social media platforms have certain standards, have certain guidelines around climate, and we are asking them to live up to their own guidelines. Unfortunately, on Twitter now, there don't seem to be any implementation of those guidelines. In fact, many of those climate deniers and those who are attacking climate activists who were once banned under the previous CEO, have now been reinstated. And the level of climate disinformation has spiked. In fact, during the last COP, the hashtag climate scam was trending. And I think you will still find, I found months later, it was still there as a trending hashtag. So we've got a real problem. And what we're finding ourselves having to do, those of us who are communicating for climate action, are communicating for facts and science, are finding that we just have to get better and continue to appeal to social media companies for the sake of our planet and for the sake of themselves to please try to enforce their moderation policies, so that we can have an information environment that is more based on facts and science than lies.
We're going to turn to the next question. This is both for George and Patricia. Political will for climate action in Kenya and Brazil has been stronger than other parts of the world. What are your communication strategies doing most effectively to enhance that political will? George, want to go first? I know President Ruto is gearing up for the Africa Climate Summit in September. So let's start with you.
Yeah, definitely. The political will you see does not just come easily. It definitely is built over time. And we've seen that with Kenya. It's not just with President Ruto. It's been, with President Uhuru, we saw him at the global stage. But most important is, it's something that has been built over time. The civil society network, the business network in the country have combined efforts over time to ensure that, we are providing the right kind of communications. We are connecting it to lived experiences, which makes it easy for the political leaders to see the need for climate action and speak about it, because they live it. They see communities that live it. They connect with it, and they also have the backing. When they get back home, there's been, a lot of effort going into educating communities. There's a lot of effort going into educating different audiences and different climate campaigns. We've seen Kenyan climate activists at the global stage, right? So when they speak there, our political leaders, they have the support. They feel they have the support. They come back home to a very well-educated community and understands, what does climate mean to us as a community? And I would say that's where the political will has come from. But, we still need more. We still need to keep doing more. We need to keep communicating more. We need to build the support base needed. We need to provide the cover that is needed for the political will to just move from, it's a political will to action, right? Because it can be a political will. It can be, yes, we are talking about it, at conferences, but when it comes to action, we don't take it forward. So how do we ensure that we keep communicating and educating different communities and audiences and supporting the political will that is there and using it very well to harness the action that is needed. But we keep also, I think what also has worked has been celebrating wins, right? So when our political leaders do good, we celebrate them. We also tell them, thank you, thank you for taking action. Thank you for speaking about 1, 2, 3 things. Thank you, for highlighting issues that are affecting not just Kenya, but the world. So we have to encourage our leaders by celebrating the wins that are there, but also being very clear with what is it we want them to say when we get into meetings with them, when we write, when they read community innovations that are there, community solutions that are there. What are they seeing? I think it's really working well when they see like our president, when he sees our climate activists in the global stage from Kenya, he sees different climate innovations at different global stages. He feels, or they feel, very encouraged to keep supporting and providing the political will that's there. And as you mentioned, the Africa Climate Summit, Action Summit that's happening in September, bringing together, key and critical African leaders and global leaders to say, what is it? How do we move from rhetoric to actually actioning, and ensuring that we are also, actioning with one voice. We are building consensus and actioning as a collective, and moving away from, siloed conversations and siloed actioning to let's do it together.
Patricia, I feel like the latest presidential campaign, climate change was the biggest topic that was being debated. So talk to me a little bit about the context in Brazil.
Yeah, so Brazil, I'm just picking up on what George said, the example from the COVID, and I think like people, as like we joked, it's not a joke, but we joked that the COVID was bad enough, but we had like President Bolsonaro, which is even worse. So you can imagine how you can, like, with the level of articulation and integration that has to happen to overcome such high level message on COVID, on misinformation or data. So what we created is like a mainstream action across different sectors with the media and the scientists and the civil society and indigenous organization and community organization throughout the country to develop like like an extra official portal where people could see how many people are dying from COVID and how intense the monitoring was happening. So that was just to address how like quickly we were able to overcome some of these challenges, although of course we have so many and we lost so many lives because of those inaction and spread of fake news. In terms of the climate change, I think that we have now changed with the government, and what I think, like in Copenhagen at the Conference of Paris on climate change last year in Egypt, I think like our elected president was like one of the major attractions of the conference, not only because most of the leaders didn't commit themselves to reduce dramatically greenhouse emissions. I think the results of COP were not like highly efficient or sufficient, if you will, right? Gave a message of despair by assuming a global guilt, or like assuming the guilt of destabilizing climate, globally, and understanding that some communities are vulnerable and is already being affected and will. So let's create a fund that address loss and damage, but we don't have money yet on that. And we have not yet decided who is going to be receiving or not those resources. But on that, the rejoin of Brazil into the climate agreement, and the serious commitment of an ex-president that's already showed that economic development can happen without cutting a single tree, without like violating indigenous people rights. So like came to the forefront. So I think like now we are living this moment where again, the Amazon has been negotiated as like at the global level as a common good for the benefits it provides for the climate crisis and climate regulation. But we do have within the country actions that are mobilizing and trying not only to protect that ecosystem, to protect the people, but also to address the global inequalities on this climate crisis. So addressing and putting at the forefront a message that global leaders or countries that are leading economically the economy globally should be doing their lessons as well, should be committed to protect this ecosystem. A tremendous message that we came from that is like a recently paper on science that show that outside we have deforestation in the Amazon and in the global, I'm not talking about Amazonia itself, but like we have very few tropical ecosystem left in the world. And when we take that to the Amazon region across boundaries, I'm not talking about Brazil, but the 9 countries that share the Amazon ecosystem, out of what is already being deforested, what is left of the Amazon, 38% is degraded, which means that the forest is not performing anymore the role that it has in terms of the climate regulation. So, and then the majority of the drivers responsible for this impact on forest degradation is climate change, increasing drought and increasing fire incidents in the global south. So we do have some lessons that we can address as individual countries, like, you know, protecting, securing the rights, protecting, monitoring the forest and activities that are depleting that. But also we need like the global leaders and then the countries across the world to really committed to reducing the emissions. So I think these messages are coming along quite well in terms of people already, as Melissa brought and then George as well, that people already experiencing the limits of growth, the limits of economic benefits that they can experience and their impact on their health and perspective of the future. So even if it's for tourism or not, yeah.
Great. And I think all eyes are going to be on Brazil for the G20 presidency and also COP30. So we are hoping and that we can all work together with Brazil leading that. I wanted to go back to Melissa quickly for our last audience question, specifically about the UN, and you're not doing enough. So can you just talk a little bit about, you know, there is this country-led and there's the grassroots that we're talking about, but one of the audience members really does not know what the UN is doing for climate. So maybe I can just give you a little space to just talk a little bit more about, from like a top-down perspective, what are you doing to address the root cause of climate disinformation? That's a question.
On the disinformation side, yeah, I think I think we're speaking out a lot, publishing the IPCC reports, convening under, you know, the COPs. I think our Secretary General has been probably the most outspoken leader on the world stage around what is happening to our world and what needs to be done, the solutions. So I think the UN has a central role in bringing about climate action in a very complex, interconnected world, and we've heard this, where we cannot just be individual nation states and think that we can survive without caring for the Amazon, as you said, is part of our common good for the world. Great example. Or so. Yes, so the UN, I think, is doing a lot. And on the information space, we have a climate communications campaign. We're very much hoping to take our Verified initiative and shift Verified into climate as well, to supercharge the UN's climate communications capabilities around the world, to be able to leverage all those media partnerships and influencer partnerships and micro-influencer partnerships that we've developed under our COVID campaign. And also in this case, our celebrity supporters, people like Leo DiCaprio, who in the climate space has an enormous influence. So I think the more we're able to invest and that we're asking for investment in communication here. By contrast, the fossil fuel industry is pouring in billions into their
Mhm.
advertising. And it is something that only with voices from all over the world that we can compete against. Additionally, we are working on a UN code of conduct on information integrity on digital platforms. I think during this conversation, each of us spoke about being up against very harmful disinformation that is leading people astray, that is allowing leaders to duck under distortion, to not take action. So we believe that the social media companies have an outsized power over the information ecosystems around the world, and have an outsized responsibility as well. But not only them, the entire environment that feeds into it. It's the advertisers, it's the PR companies who are also enabling false information to circulate and infect our world negatively. So we're hoping that these guidelines that will come out of the UN Code of Conduct, which will be published in about a year ahead of the UN Summit for the Future, that is really looking at how we could have a better, a more civil information ecosystem in the digital space, and to have those digital communities be as they profess. They call themselves global town squares. Let's have global town squares that are inclusive, where people have a voice and where there are certain rules of discourse, and where hate and disinformation have no place.
Great. That sounds fantastic. I have one final question for all the panelists before we close. Talking about climate change oftentimes feels very daunting. There's lots of doom and gloom out there. So what is the one thing that gives you hope in your area? Quick, rapid fire answers. George, put you on the spot.
Thanks. I think for me, what gives me hope is just the many initiatives we see, especially people starting to accept that the role communications plays in championing and ensuring climate action, and just the coordinated efforts across different sectors. So you find, young people are up there in the stage. You find, doctors and scientists. You find communicators. It shows that we all are starting now to figure out how do we solve the problem, and we are building consensus together. Well, just also the acceptance of we need to, ensure that we are providing and supporting a lot of digital literacy across different sectors, and seeing people already doing it, seeing the consensus being built, and people coming together, and the convenings already happening gives me a lot of hope.
Perfect. Patricia, over to you.
Yeah, I think like I have, George mentioned, I think I have been witnessing so many positive social tipping points, which are points of where people accept collectively and then do something about it. And it's a similar word for transformation of they have been testing what or witnessing what has worked and not worked, and then are trying to do something different. So for instance, the youth movements in large cities, like mega cities, like in Sao Paulo, people, the youth are not driving individual cars, are like demanding and using more collectively the public transportation, which is really bad in the global south, as you can imagine. And so demanding that their money be invested in vehicles that are able to collectively carry more people under like low emission sector. At the same time, we have been seeing movements that are implementing organic farming or solutions, nature-based solutions, bringing forest back to cities that are really solutions that are low costs, but highly effective over longer time scales. At the same time, I bet I have been witnessing even within a very like conservative sector, which, as I mentioned, the agribusiness sector. I don't want to put everybody on the same pocket, but there's some actions that are really like farmers that have an excess of native vegetation are being rewarded for maintaining that forest instead of chopping down and making that a profitable commodity that are not really addressing climate change. So this investing also heavily in reforestation across different ecosystems, including the Amazon, like private sectors like putting this money. So as George mentioned, I think like I'm witnessing this points of transitioning of like positive social tipping points, but I agree that it's not enough. We needed to do more, but I'm highly optimistic. And then I think the fact that the UN agreed to have the conference of parties in one of the Amazon states also can make a huge difference of showing different perspective, different ways of living, and within like unique ecosystem and the need to protect. So I hope that can also mobilize some of these leaders and actors to really demanding actions in a more speedy way.
Hey, Melissa.
Okay, very briefly, I just feel hopeful that the world is awakening. I'm seeing people who are uninformed becoming informed.
Mhm.
I'm seeing people who are lethargic becoming motivated, and very many people wanting to join forces to make change and to join forces with us, communicating the science of climate change and what one can do to stop it, the solutions around it, but also wanting to take their own individual action, whether it is to lobby their governments or to change certain aspects of their lifestyles, that they can make a positive contribution to reducing their own emissions and influencing their own networks. So I do see hope. Is it urgent enough? I'm hopeful. I think that there is still time to reverse things and to envision that future where we can live in harmony with nature.
Right. Well, I just want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to have this great conversation. Climate change communication is often not communicated enough about. So I'm just really thrilled that we were able to take some time and really give a deep dive into what it takes to effectively communicate and build that political and public will for climate action. It is our privilege at the foundation to partner with people like yourselves as we move closer to reducing emissions. We were a proud partner of Verified, and we're just so thrilled by the impact that you guys have achieved through that. And protecting vulnerable communities, unlocking more resources for communities all around the world is just something that we are really moving forward on in the work that we're doing around climate change. So just thrilled to be working with you and having such great partners on board. To those of you who are viewing this episode of RF Breakthrough, we also want to thank you for tuning in and listening. We encourage you to continue the conversation online and engage with our panelists using the hashtag RF Breakthrough on social media. So if you enjoy this conversation and want to see more of these types of discussions, you can also visit us online at rockefellerfoundation.org/RF Breakthrough. And with that, I bid you adieu. Thank you.